This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to The Hindu's In Focus podcast. Budget 2024-25 saw several initiatives around employment and skilling being proposed. Do these form a good first step in addressing the jobs challenge the country faces? Or should the government have begun addressing the problem at the level of primary school and worked upwards? Dr. Amit Basole, Professor of Economics at Azim Premji University, who also has special interests in the area of labor and employment, joins us today to throw some light on the issue at hand. Professor Basole, truly appreciate your being with us today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
So, basis proposals announced in the budget, there seem to be a consolidation of about 5 schemes that seem to look at employment, upskilling, and so on and so forth. But some of this is somewhat confusing to me. If I read it for the first time, not everything seems clear, because there is one that looks like direct benefit transfer to the employee, especially if it's a first-time employment that they go in for. So if we take this one by one, I just wanted to understand if you feel that given our success with direct benefit transfers with various segments of society, this is very simply and quickly done. Would it be a fair assumption to make that?
So, the way I understand this particular, the DBT, there's scheme A, I think, as they call it in the document, is that if you show up for the first time in the EPFO database, I guess that's how they know you're a first-time worker, which is different from being a first-time worker, I should point out, right? Because you might have been working earlier and in the informal sector or whatever, and being converted to a PF, getting formal worker. But anyway, setting that aside, the first time you show up in the database is when you become eligible for this DBT. And that should not be so hard to do since you are in the system and they know who you are and so forth. Yes.
But again, this may not be very clear, and I don't know if it's actually part of the finance bill and it's clearer there. Because, for instance, pre-COVID, I was speaking to an Uber driver, and he was like late 20s, and he was saying, I've actually worked in 3 different auto parts manufacturing companies, 1 year of probation, so 3 years of experience, but nobody wanted to renew or confirm my employment. It could be various reasons. It could be a skill level. It could be that they did not need people, whatever. And he was like lamenting, saying, had I known this during my own 10th standard at that age, I would have stopped studying and invested in cars so that I could have a fleet by now. So that seemed to be, and we've had some examples of similar examples of such drivers. So assuming something like that happens, if you're an observer of what the government is doing with, public funds, if such a one-time transfer came to me and I'm a first-time employee, and it so happens I'm not confirmed and I move on to the next. So it's a one-off. So I get a transfer which was in 3 installments. Whether or not I continue my employment, I would get that money and I'm done, right? That's how it is?
That is how I read it, yes.
Okay. So would it actually serve a long-term purpose? How do you think this would help, or what are your views on this?
Yeah, so I think that is, really the question here beyond the nitty-gritties of each of the schemes, and they all will have their rules and so forth. The question, how do we think about this employment push and vis-a-vis what the economy would needs and so forth? So I should start by saying that I think the signaling aspect should be acknowledged, that this is possibly the first time that this the employment situation has been foregrounded in this way. The bringing together, calling it the employment linked incentive, obviously to invoke parallels with the production linked incentive schemes, the internship stuff that maybe we can talk about also. So there's an employment focus to the budget that seems significant from a signaling point of view. Of course, we want to go beyond signaling and actually create employment. Now, there is where the question comes: what do we think are the main constraints, on job creation? Right? So if we look at these kinds of schemes, and there is a version of this already out there under the name the Pradhan Mantri Rozgar Protsahan Yojana, which is a few years old now, which also works through the Provident Fund system and essentially subsidizes, by paying a part of the contribution, it subsidizes that aspect of the cost to the employer. So they are all ways of reducing the cost of new employment for employers in a way, right? Most of them play on this variation. Now, that would work if we thought that the main constraint to employers hiring new workers is this cost of either hiring an extra worker or formalizing the worker. Let's say you're not paying PF or you're working through some other means and now you have to do it. The government is saying, well, we will defray part of the cost for part of the year, and that should sweeten the deal for you somewhat. If we think these are the constraints, and there's an interview in today's Hindu actually with TV Somnathan where he's sort of arguing the same, the interview. He's talking about at the margin, we expect this to happen, and at the margin is a very well used term here because we're talking about that additional hiring. However, if we think that there are some bigger structural reasons why the economy is not able to create the required number of such jobs, and that could include an insufficient demand. There's been a lot of talk about how consumption has grown weakly, how the informal sector is not doing well, and so forth, which links up to inadequate demand in the economy. And connects back to the lack of private investment, which has been the topic of discussion for so long. If these are the issues, then the companies are not constrained by those costs. They are constrained by just capacity not being used enough. And so there's no reason to hire new people. And once that reason comes up, perhaps they won't care about these kinds of costs, right? That's one type of argument. Now, I don't think that makes it useless at all. I think it just means that we have to think carefully about which are the employers who we think really would care about something like this, whose decision making would actually be influenced. And I think we haven't done the required research to really say that with confidence, but I'll say one thing and then I'll stop. My intuition is that smaller employers would be likely to care more, because by smaller, I mean, companies that employ, let's say, 100 workers or 50 workers or 40 workers or whatever. These are small firms. And there are a lot of these, right, in the PF system, etc. as well. They have smaller margins, they're operating on tighter, more competitive kind of environment. And you can imagine that they have less room to maneuver with these kinds of costs. So if I come in and say, okay, you can hire these new people, I'll defray some of these costs, maybe that encourages them to pick up the hiring. Does that continue when the scheme runs out? That's also a question we don't know the answer to. So these are all, I think, things that hopefully research will also answer. So sorry, long-winded answer, but yeah.
No, because I'm not really clued into the sector, it really helps me understand. So please, thank you. So when you're talking about structural issues, and I've spent a very small amount of time, barely 2 months, but it gave me good insight into instructing fresh graduates just out of college for TCS, an arm called Ignite in Chennai. But then I moved on from there. And then, of course, the reports that we see that, fifth standard kids can't answer second standard questions and so on and so forth, math and English. So there is a structural problem. And I also have friends who try and do something outside of their core work hours for education, in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar and so on and so forth, where one school with multiple grades of students has a single teacher, and then teacher absenteeism or the quality of teachers, and so on and so forth. So would you call, and you talked about signaling, so I would imagine you would probably call this a first step, but actually a lot of grassroots level work has to happen over a period of maybe a couple of decades before we can actually see a difference, or is it too long to wait before the rest of the world overtakes us?
Fact is that one can't wait for anything per se, because there are different problems at different stages, if you will, right? So if you imagine the worker's life cycle, then there's the question of primary schooling or general education. There's the question of vocational or professional training. And then there's the question of transitioning from finishing your education to getting a job. These are all important milestones, and they have different challenges associated with each stage. And many of those are well understood. I think what this particular collection of policies, including that internship type of policy, is trying to address is that last question of you finished whatever training it is, and you can't get that start in the workforce. So we are going to try to make it a little easier for first-time entrants to find jobs. This seems to be the thinking, whether by giving them some real experience through internships or by making the cost of hiring cheaper for first-time workers for employers. And it's a good area to focus on, holding constant whatever training and education has been received. I mean, these people have already finished that. So it's not like you can go back and say, well, get better educated. That's not an option for. So you need to work on this as well. And of course, as you're right, that further up the pipeline, naturally, we do need to think about these serious issues. And there are so many surveys that keep coming up talking about employability. Employers also seem to think that people are not ready when especially young people to work, need whatever skills, soft skills, hard skills, and so on. So all of that needs work, and some of that shows up in the budget. General education stuff, yeah, I mean, we've known for a long time that we need to do this.
Okay, if I just have to get into the nitty-gritty of the budget itself, and the schemes that were being talked about, I think Scheme D and Scheme C. First time read, I actually got confused. I thought they looked very similar. And then I understood that the difference was in the words first time employment and additional employees. Is that the only difference? Is there some light you can throw on how these two are different from each other?
So I think that is also my understanding. Again, I have not done a very detailed study. I think there are some more. I got an impression from reading some of the coverage that there are some rules about parents not having IT returns being a condition for one of these. I don't know which one it is. I think it's a way of targeting maybe more deserving, socioeconomic disadvantaged people and so on. I don't know which scheme it is. But going back to your question, I think B and C, yes, the difference, they both work through PFO, so that's the similarity. And the difference is one is for new entrants and one is for any additional worker that you hire, I guess, on your books. So that could be an existing person in the workforce that is transferring from somewhere to somewhere else, maybe. I don't know.
Okay. So again, that leaves open the next corollary question that I had, saying if I'm an employer and I'm benefiting from this, and if my headcount actually goes down 1 year and then goes back up 1 year, what is an additional employee? I don't know. Is it from X minus delta, then you begin from there, or it's actually X and only then will you get any benefits? It's not clear yet, right?
Right. Yeah, I don't know how this is going to be operationalized. I think all of these will require quite a bit of rules. In fact, even states, Gujarat and a couple of other states, I think have had this kind of PF-based subsidy schemes even before the central scheme came up. I think the Rozgar Protsahan Yojana came up during COVID, if I'm not mistaken. But even before that, there were these state level schemes. There is enough out there now in terms of experience of administering such things to see, how are they doing it and is it working? But I haven't seen any detailed study come out of it yet.
So these kinds of, at least the three schemes that we talked about, would you think that they would help formalize the workforce much more than we already have seen? Because, an industry like construction industry, if it's mostly informal, and if an employee saw benefit in this, especially the small time guys and not the large, sort of, not the Hiranandanis, but others, do you think that would actually help in formalizing the workforce across sectors or any specific sectors that lend themselves to it?
See, there are two ways in which you can think about this formalization question. One is small firms that are not yet formal grow their businesses, hire more workers, and cross the threshold for becoming formal, and then therefore they are formal. And their workforce also then becomes formal, right? So you imagine a firm that only employs 7 or 8 people, over time is able to grow to 15, 20, 25 people. There are many, many such firms in India, hundreds of thousands of firms which are tiny. If they grow and become formal, then that's one way of formalizing the economy through scaling up of smaller firms. The other is by shifting workers from informal firms to existing formal firms, where existing formal firms then grow and hire more workers. These kinds of schemes that we are talking about are more the latter kind. Right? I mean, there are, of course, first-time entrants. So we are subsidizing first-time entrants into the formal sector. So you have to imagine now a choice that that worker might end up working in an informal firm or a formal firm, and you're making it easier for them to work in that formal firm by making it less costly for the formal firm to hire that worker. That's one sort of a situation. Uh, all of these things should end up formalizing, but the question on net, does it happen or not? And this is where the structural point comes back into play, is that the Provident Fund system, or broadly speaking, this formal system, is a minor part of the Indian workforce. Right? It's about, I think PF rolls are something like 65 million workers stock. And then, about 500 or 600,000 firms regularly pay into it and so on. But the Indian workforce is, of course, over 600 million people, a lot of them in agriculture and so forth. So what happens in the rest of it matters for the structure of the economy per se. So if I'm creating more formal employment and people are going there, but elsewhere, right, or if the pace of that creation falls behind three things: new people entering the workforce, people leaving the agricultural sector, and people wanting to leave petty trade and retail and those kinds of surplus labor activities or domestic service and wanting jobs. You can even include your gig worker in that, because if they want a proper formal job, then so these are all categories of people who are looking for formal work, and so that's the supply of labor to the formal sector, and then there is intake happening. Now, if that intake is happening, that's good. But if it is smaller than this influx of workers, then of course, on balance, the structure of the economy is not changing in the desirable direction. So you need to create jobs at least equal to these kinds of people coming in, and that's when the structure is going to start moving. And if you see from the PLFS data, the proportion of workers who have regular salaried jobs, which is all PF workers and then some who don't have PF, etc., that proportion hasn't changed a lot since 1718 or 1819. In the last 5 years or so, it's kind of stuck. That means that on net, we are not creating enough of these kinds of regular salaried opportunities. For that, such schemes, I think, are not the answer, because they are operating on the margin. Right? And that's where we go back to the question of capacity utilization, demand. Firms really, if they are interested in hiring, then they might not look at many of these things, and they'll just start hiring. Right? And that's a very different kind of a labor market than what we have right now. So yeah, I would say, it's a tricky question to think about whether formalization per se on net, what are you talking about, or the structure of the whole workforce?
So since you mentioned in one scenario, then this is not the answer to such a problem. I had this for later in the conversation, but since you mentioned this, if you had 2 lakh crore at your disposal, how would you have distributed this?
Well, that's not something I can answer, because I'm not used to having to think about these kinds of things. I'll just say one thing which actually connects back to something that is part of the budget, which is the focus on MSMEs. Right? I mentioned earlier that what are the kinds of employers for whom this might matter, and smaller employers maybe. And going back to the question of where do broadly jobs come from, we know that large firms, corporate India and so forth, that's not where a lot of the numbers come from. These are either capital intensive firms, or they are just, a small part of the entire equation, even though they may be large per se. Like you may be employing, 10,000 workers, but there are only a few hundred such companies. There are hundreds of thousands of other companies. So money spent on the MSMEs, other things equal, I think, probably gives you higher multiplier effects on jobs. And when I say money spent on MSMEs, you can take different ways. The budget talks about deregulation, infrastructure, couple of things at least. And we all know that compliances are an issue. It has been long talked about. And we know that local infrastructure is a big issue. So that brings me to my sort of where would I spend that money question, right? That we've had a few years of solid focus on capital expenditure and infrastructure, highways, airports, ports, and there's no disputing the importance of those things broadly. But we also know that the moment you go off the highway, there's a different world waiting for you, right? And the example I give to my students is compare airports and bus stands, right? Most people are at bus stands, and that's how they're traveling, or railways and so on. So we are not talking about Vande Bharat, we are talking about all the entire rest of the railways. So as long as we are prioritizing the Airports and the Vande Bharats, we are not quite there where we'll get the bang for the buck, right? Now, if you start improving local roads, improve the power situation, water situation, make it easier for local businesses to conduct businesses and, get workers moving, public safety for women, many things that we know we need to do at the local level. That's where I think you'll get a lot of bang for your buck. It's harder to spend this money because it goes through state governments, ULBs, and the state budget has a lot of focus on states. To their credit, even the economic survey keeps talking about how many of these things are state level things, and I'm glad that that's part of the discussion. So urban local bodies, state government, these are where a lot of these constraints actually get addressed. So a way to get that money down there and then ensuring that it is spent is where the action is. And we know that from the experience of China, Vietnam, other countries, that how much money gets spent at the local level really matters. And we haven't done that well. Our expenditure is very top heavy still.
And if I look at the other schemes on upgrading the ITIs, this is something we've seen in other budgets by other governments in power. But I don't know, things may not have moved, or allocations may not have been enough, or poorly utilized. Where do you feel our ITIs stand? Because I thought they did contribute or could contribute significantly to the skilling of the workforce that goes into these small MSMEs on the margins.
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on ITIs. My knowledge is limited to just reading, work that other people have done. Among others, Professor Santosh Mehrotra, who does a lot of work on vocational training education, has written about it. Other people have written about it. We've had a problem with ITI curricula being outdated, and placements being difficult, particularly beyond there are certain ITIs I think that work well, which are integrated into the kind of manufacturing ecosystem in hubs. If you're thinking of Gurgaon or Manesar or something, a lot of those workers would come from ITIs, and that might work. But then beyond that, there's a whole world. So I'm glad again that there is this focus on, I think, 1,000 ITIs there. The modernization of the curriculum is likely to be, an important thing there, and connecting between centers and employers. Again, that I'm not sure how strong the feedback is between what employers would like workers to come with and what the centers are delivering in terms of instruction. So, and I don't want to say it's not happening because I haven't looked at it, so maybe it does happen. But I think that is without that, in a very fast changing market, it's hard to imagine that you're doing the training that really the labor market requires. So one hopes that this is part of that thinking.
Yeah, just one final question. We have 5 more minutes to go. The fifth scheme was talked about internships, 1 crore youths and all that. So I probably, your point about whether it's structurally required at all. If the companies had a better market in terms of demand, employment would automatically sort of gallop. If we go by that premise, even if the finance minister claims we are not making anything mandatory, we are only nudging the employers, would this internship scheme actually help logically? I know it remains to be seen, but logically would it help? Because you're making the employers pay 10% of internship stipend and all of the training cost, even if it comes from the CSR funds, and saying we will recognize CSR funds. Do you think this will take off, or what's your view on this?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I'll set aside the question of numbers because some people have put out that the numbers don't seem to be very favorable. The number of people that would need to be taken by one company sounds very large to me, some 4,000 a year over 5 years, something like that. That seems unrealistic. But setting aside that question, I'm glad again that this has come to the fore, and this was part of the election cycle debate as well, with that apprenticeship idea that was floating around. That there's a role for the government to play in, again, doing some kind of matching with new workers and employers, or helping workers who are not able to get a toehold in the workforce some initial experience. How do we get them into that? And then they fend for themselves. Then they either get the experience, get jobs elsewhere or whatever. But we've done our bit of that obstacle that might face them. I think that's a good sentiment. Again, how do you operationalize it. I think the focus on top firms is maybe because partly it's aspirational and partly because it's easy to administer something like this through a few big firms. But again, the kind of people they're talking about who might benefit and so on might be much more in smaller towns, etc. And smaller companies maybe where this may turn out to be better, but administrating it through a lot of smaller companies is hard. So I don't know unless you again do a lot of decentralization and local. So you can think of local level apprenticeship schemes. I'm talking about like a class 2, class 3 town. Think of a district town or a small or a block town with businesses in that town and youth in that town, matching them, subsidizing them for some work, like that kind of scenario. This is not quite that. That would be harder to do, but I think probably where the numbers are and probably where the candidates are who would really benefit from this thing. That's the other thing, that we know that social networks are very important in your first entry in the labor market. So if you're coming from a family that is already educated or has some corporate connections or whatever else, then internships also come your way, other things come your way, and that transition is not so hard for you. But for the vast majority of the country's youth, you don't know anyone who can give you that kind of opportunity. So that's where such a system really would make a huge difference if it worked well. But yeah, I mean, these are all unknowns about how it's actually going to pan out. We'll have to see.
Thank you so much, Professor Basole. Truly insightful observations. So obviously the numbers are encouraging, at least as a first step, is what I take away from this conversation. And the devil, as always, lies in the details. Truly appreciate your being with us today. Look forward to more such insights from you in the future. Bye.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.